There is a particular kind of confidence you get when you have never been seriously punched back. You forget it is even possible. You start to believe that the world runs on the rules you are used to, that bigger always wins, that economic pressure always cracks the other side first, and that a few weeks of airstrikes will make someone reasonable who was not reasonable before. And then you discover that the person you were pressuring controls a door through which 20% of the world's oil and natural gas passes every single day. And they have quietly locked it, and they are charging $2 million per ship to use it. Paid, as it happens, in Chinese currency, not yours. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the United States of America in the spring of 2026, learning a very old lesson about leverage at a price tag that Goldman Sachs is estimating in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And the truly remarkable thing is not that it happened. It is that almost nobody in Washington saw it coming. Or, more accurately, some people did see it coming and said so and were ignored, which is a different problem entirely. The version of events that the Trump administration has been selling goes roughly like this. The United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike campaign against Iran on February 28, 2026. The campaign, Trump announced almost immediately, was an overwhelming success. More than 7,800 military targets were struck. 120 Iranian ships were destroyed. 11 submarines. The infrastructure of Iran's nuclear and military capacity was, in the administration's framing, devastated. Trump announced the achievement of military objectives approximately 39 times, depending on which weekend you were counting. Now, I want to be fair to that framing. The strikes did cause significant damage. Iran's pharmaceutical factories were hit. Steel infrastructure, petrochemical facilities, Iran's main natural gas field. The kind of damage that, in a conventional war, would suggest a losing side. And Iran did sustain enormous losses, an estimated $270 billion in war damage by most credible estimates. Here is the part that did not go according to plan. Iran did not collapse, its government did not fall, its population by most accounts did not rise up and demand surrender. What happened instead is that Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, not completely, not for everyone, but for the ships of countries that had participated in or supported the war against it. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar. Their ships stopped moving, which meant a significant share of the world's energy supply stopped moving. And Donald Trump, who ran for president twice on the promise that he would bring prices down, suddenly had a gas crisis on his hands. That is the part you will not find in the victory announcements. Gas prices in the United States rose 34% compared to a year earlier. Diesel, the fuel that moves goods across the country, that drives the trucks, that stocks the shelves, rose more than 50%. To put that in human terms, the American family that was already stretched by post-pandemic inflation, that had voted for Trump specifically because he promised prices would come down, was now paying dramatically more every time they filled their tank, or went to the grocery store, because diesel prices get into everything. They get into food, into shipping, into the cost of every product that moves from a factory to a shelf. Goldman Sachs projected Brent crude averaging $105 a barrel in March, rising to $115 in April. In an adverse scenario, defined as the strait staying disrupted for 10 weeks, they estimated oil hitting $140 a barrel. In a severely adverse scenario involving persistent production damage, $160 a barrel. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, which is not generally known for apocalyptic projections, published analysis concluding that even under a cautiously optimistic scenario, Hormuz closed for just one quarter, U.S. headline inflation would rise by 0.6 percentage points and core inflation by 0.2. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, which the Fed targets at 2%, was being projected to hit 4% by end of year, double the target. At the point I am recording this, Oxford Economics forecasts 2026 would bring the slowest annual consumption growth since 2013, excluding the pandemic. The Center for American Progress noted, with what I can only describe as restrained frustration, that by neglecting the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and making electric vehicles more expensive before the war, the administration had ensured the United States was maximally exposed to exactly this kind of shock. which is the kind of sentence that looks very prescient in retrospect and very inconvenient if you are the one who made those decisions. The cost of the military operation itself, over $11 billion in the first 6 days alone. The Pentagon then sent a request to the White House for $200 billion in additional funding from Congress. When asked to confirm the number, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said, and I am reading this directly, "It takes money to kill bad guys." The nation's debt was, at that point, past $39 trillion. That is not a foreign policy. That is an invoice. Here is the thing about the Strait of Hormuz that is worth understanding. Iran did not close it completely. That is an important detail that tends to get lost. Countries that remained neutral or that maintained relationships with Iran continued to move ships through. China's ships moved, Russia's ships moved. Countries that did not participate in the war or its support structure, their ships kept going. The closure was targeted. It was surgical, in a way that American airstrikes were not. Every country that had supported the coalition against Iran suddenly found its energy lifeline operating at reduced capacity, or not at all. And Iran started charging $2 million per tanker, in Chinese yuan, for the privilege of transit, which is either an act of piracy or a demonstration of extraordinary leverage, depending on your perspective. And from a purely analytical standpoint, the two things are not mutually exclusive. What this created was a situation in which Iran, the country that had supposedly been defeated, was effectively billing the global economy for access to its own oil supply, while the United States, the world's preeminent military power, watched its strategic petroleum reserves being drawn down to what one analyst called, I want to get this right, sludge level. The thing nobody wanted to admit at the start of this war is that Iran had been preparing for exactly this scenario for over 3 decades. Underground cities, dispersed manufacturing, air defense systems moved underground. A military strategy built entirely on the assumption that the United States would eventually come, and that survival, not victory in the conventional sense, but survival, would itself constitute a kind of victory, and that is, as it turns out, exactly what happened. So, the deal. As I record this, the United States and Iran are somewhere in the process of finalizing a memorandum of understanding, a document that Trump has announced is essentially complete approximately 39 times since April, which is either a negotiating tactic, an optimism problem, or a relationship with timelines that is somewhat unorthodox. Pakistan's prime minister called it historic. Iran's foreign ministry said it might take a few more days to finalize. These two descriptions are not necessarily incompatible. What is in the deal, or what Iran says should be in the deal, which is a different thing, is worth spending a moment on because the list is not what a winning power typically demands from a losing one. Iran wants an immediate and permanent halt to the war, including in Lebanon. It wants a commitment from the United States not to interfere in its internal affairs. It wants the full lifting of the naval blockade within 30 days. It wants the withdrawal of U.S. forces from areas adjacent to Iran. It wants the Strait of Hormuz to reopen under Iranian arrangements. Note, Iranian arrangements, within 30 days. It wants sanctions on Iranian oil and petrochemicals suspended, with access to related financial resources. It wants a 60-day negotiation period for nuclear issues. And it wants the United States and its allies to provide somewhere in the range of $300 billion in reconstruction funding. $300 billion. Iran has also notably demanded the release of $24 billion in frozen assets, with half of that available before negotiations even begin. Now, the Trump administration has publicly rejected the idea of paying reparations to Tehran. Trump himself said so on Truth Social, which is of course where major foreign policy positions are now announced. The fine print of what the administration has actually agreed to versus what it has publicly rejected is, as I record this, somewhat unclear. What is clear is that this does not look like a negotiation in which the United States is dictating terms. It looks like a negotiation in which the United States very much needs the Strait of Hormuz to open, which is a different kind of conversation. The administration, of course, has been asked about all of this. When pressed on the status of the negotiations, the White House said, and I will summarize rather than quote at length, that the president has a proven track record of achieving good deals on behalf of the United States, that Vice President Vance and Special Envoy Witkoff and Jared Kushner were handling talks in Islamabad, and that the president would only accept a deal that puts America first. I want to give that statement the credit it is due. It is technically composed of words. It is arranged in grammatically complete sentences. It does not reveal, in any meaningful way, what concessions the United States is making, whether the $300 billion reconstruction figure is on the table, what happens to Iran's nuclear enrichment program, or what the sequencing of sanctions relief will be. It is a press release written to fill the space where information would otherwise go. The Iran International News Service described the emerging terms as focused on reopening the strait and easing pressure on Iran, while leaving the main declared goals of the war: the nuclear program, Iran's missile capabilities, its support for armed groups, largely unresolved. One former senior official described the reported terms as catastrophic for Israel and the wider free world. Whether that is an accurate description of the terms or an attempt to prevent a deal being signed at all is, at this point, difficult to determine from the outside. Both things are simultaneously possible. What I can tell you is this: the United States went to war in part to eliminate Iran's nuclear threat. As of the latest reporting, Iran's ballistic missile program is not even in the draft agreement. That is either a placeholder for Phase 2 or a fairly significant indicator of how this negotiation is actually going. You are free to choose which. Let us talk about what this has done to Donald Trump domestically, because the foreign policy story and the domestic political story are, at this point, the same story. Trump's approval rating has dropped to the mid-30s, not the low 40s where unpopular presidents usually stabilize. The mid-30s. 3 separate polls, Reuters Ipsos, AP Norc, and Strength in Numbers Verisight, all placed him between 33 and 36% in April. A Fox News poll, which is not generally a hostile polling environment for Trump, put him at 41%, his worst showing in that poll since 2017. The Brookings Institution noted that 1 in 4 Americans who voted for Trump in 2024 now opposes the war. Since the war began, the president's job approval has declined by more than 3 percentage points to around 40%. Democrats' advantage in generic congressional balloting has risen to nearly 7 points, a swing of 9 points from 2024. And here is the detail that I think is most politically significant, because it points to where the real danger lies for the Republican Party. Among Republicans, the president's own voters, his own base, 27% disapproved of Trump on cost of living issues before the war. After the war started, that number rose to 34%. On inflation and rising prices specifically, Republican disapproval of Trump jumped from 28% to 40%. Trump ran for president on affordability. He ran on bringing prices down. He won, in significant part, because enough American voters believed he was the candidate who would fix the cost of eggs and gas and groceries. And the Iran war has made gas dramatically more expensive, pushed inflation to its highest level since May 2024, and created conditions that economists say will keep prices elevated throughout 2026. There is a word for a political strategy that requires you to have accomplished the exact opposite of your central campaign promise. The word is liability, and it is showing up in Republican internal polling in Senate races the party previously thought were safe. There is a question sitting underneath all of this that nobody in the mainstream conversation is quite saying out loud. So I will say it. Did the United States achieve anything? Not in the triumphalist sense, not in the did we destroy enough military targets sense, but in the strategic sense. Did the United States emerge from this conflict in a stronger position than it entered? Iran's nuclear enrichment program, the stated reason for the war, is still running. Its enrichment levels, which the IAEA had already verified at 60% purity before the conflict, are a matter of ongoing negotiation rather than a resolved issue. Iran's ballistic missile program is, as far as anyone can tell from the draft agreements, off the table entirely. Iran's support for Hezbollah and armed groups across the region, another stated objective, is also apparently not in the MOU. What the United States has achieved, definitively, is significant damage to Iranian military and industrial infrastructure, the death of Iran's supreme leader in the early strikes, and a bill, a very large bill, in money, in oil prices, in inflation, in political capital, in global standing, and in the strategic oil reserves that were supposed to buffer America from exactly this kind of energy shock. What Iran has achieved is survival, which was, by their own account, the objective all along, and leverage over the global oil supply, and a negotiating position in which the United States is, in at least some respects, going first, releasing frozen assets, lifting sanctions, opening the blockade, before Iran has committed to the things the war was supposedly fought over. The godfather of neoconservatism, and I will not name him here because the identification would distract from the point, described this as the greatest defeat the United States has ever experienced. Whether that is accurate or hyperbolic is genuinely unclear to me. What is not unclear is that it is not, by any reasonable definition, a win. So, where does this go? And I want to be honest here about how much uncertainty there is, because I think honesty about uncertainty is more useful than false confidence in either direction. The MOU, if signed, kicks off a 60-day negotiation period. Those talks will cover nuclear issues, sanctions relief, the removal of UN Security Council resolutions, and the status of frozen Iranian assets. Iran has been very clear, based on its experience with the JCPOA in 2015, where it carried out its obligations and the United States, under Obama first and Trump later, did not, that it is not doing that again. Iran wants sequencing that front-loads American commitments. Release the money, lift the blockade, stop bombing, then we talk. The Americans have a history of not honoring agreements with Iran. The Algiers Accords in 1981, which promised non-interference in Iranian affairs, violated. The JCPOA, violated by Trump in 2018, under-implemented by Obama before that. A ceasefire agreement in this very conflict, after which the United States almost immediately established a naval blockade. The Iranians have noticed this pattern. It is, as I record this, the single biggest obstacle to any agreement that actually holds. Israel is also doing what Israel tends to do in situations where a diplomatic resolution would constrain its military options. It is continuing operations. The bombing of Lebanon has, by several accounts, intensified in recent weeks rather than calming down. Israel has a structural interest in this deal not working because a working deal means the U.S. commits to Lebanon, which means Israel's room to maneuver shrinks considerably. Netanyahu has made this clear, repeatedly and without much subtlety, to anyone who is willing to listen. And Trump is caught between the political reality that he desperately needs the Strait of Hormuz to open so American gas prices fall before the midterm elections in November, and the ideological commitments he has made to the Israeli government and to the MAGA constituency that views a deal with Iran as capitulation. He needs the deal. He does not want to be seen wanting the deal. He is announcing the deal approximately every 2 weeks, while simultaneously rejecting the details of the deal. This is either a sophisticated negotiating posture or a situation that has gotten considerably more complicated than the original plan anticipated. I suspect the latter, but I cannot rule out the former. These things are not always easy to tell apart from the outside. Donald Trump set out to eliminate Iran's nuclear threat, remake the Middle East, and come home to lower gas prices and a victory parade. As it stands, the nuclear program is still running. The gas prices are up 34%. The Strait of Hormuz remains, as I record this, effectively closed for U.S.-aligned shipping. The Pentagon has asked Congress for $200 billion. Iran is demanding $300 billion in reconstruction money. And 3 polls in the last month have Trump in the mid-30s, territory that, historically, tends to precede losing a lot of congressional seats. The deal may be signed this week. It may take a few more days. The Iranians are saying the Americans need to go first on assets and sanctions before talks begin in earnest. The Americans are saying the Iranians need to open the strait before anything else moves. And somewhere in Islamabad, American diplomats are doing the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that this administration finds ideologically uncomfortable, making concessions to a country it went to war with 4 months ago. The United States set out to make Iran feel weak and dependent. Instead, it discovered that a country which controls your fuel supply and has been preparing for your arrival for 30 years is a different kind of problem than a tariff negotiation or a Twitter war, which is, of course, a lesson that was available to anyone who wanted to learn it before February 28th. I am Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, analysis from the edge. If this kind of thing is useful to you, subscribe now. The next episode will be out soon, and the strait, as of this recording, is still closed.